Well, thank you all for coming out on this finally sunny day to avoid the sun and talk about the things I've been doing here in Zurich. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this farewell lecture is, one, I don't think most of you have ever seen my work or heard me talk, and so it's a good opportunity to introduce myself as I'm walking out the door. But then also to kind of work through what my time in Zurich has brought me intellectually, and to share that with you, and to hopefully get some feedback about it, and to explain where I'm going in the next stage of my work. And so I usually put this one up just to remind people that we're dealing with Brazil, which is massive. Right? It contains most of it. You can put Europe in it many, many times. And this is where I had been living 6 years before moving to Zurich. In particular, spent my time in Rio de Janeiro, which again is a massive, massive place. 190 kilometers across the metropolitan area of 12.5 million people, and the city itself, 6 million people. So we're dealing with a relatively massive urban area, of which I can only naturally talk about just a very small bit. And so to the title of my talk, and this will be a quiz later, so burn this into your memory, is an emergent political economy of mega events, flows, circulations, and accumulations. And so welcome to the inaugural farewell lecture. What I wanted to do briefly for the first part of the talk is to tell you where I came from and how I kind of moved into this emergent political economy. And so coming out of my dissertation fieldwork, I wrote a book called Temples of the Earthbound Gods, which treated stadiums in the cultural landscapes of Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro. And at the time, I was quite, in a more traditional geographic sense, looking at the relationships between place, time, and space, and how those were expressed in and through and around the stadiums. So I'll just bring you through this very quickly. I don't really have a lot of time to go into it. You can buy the book, it's out there. And so, looking at the historical trajectory of stadiums as they fit in with capitalism and capitalist modernity and colonialism. So moving from a relatively unstructured space where you had folk traditions that were not urbanized, and as you increasingly urbanized the stadiums, you increasingly rationalized the space. So even in the 1950s and 1960s, there wasn't so much internal differentiation in stadiums. But in the 21st century, it's very rare that we see a stadium that has open, fluid spaces in the stands, and it's completely territorialized on the inside. And so these stadium developments match the way that capitalist modernity has emerged. So that's the temporal dimension. The place-based dimension of stadiums, for all of you who have been to stadium, and we was on Elizabeth's lecture on Monday, or Tuesday, is very experientially performative as well. And so you have different areas of the stadium where you perform different things. And so the cops on the outside perform one thing, the players perform another, and they all have their segmented or delineated spaces within that place to perform those activities. And then, looking from the stadium itself and increasing in scale, you can see the different kinds of memories, the different agents, the different impacts that radiate to and from that stadium as a place. And so that's just a very basic overview of where I started this research a while ago. In particular, I was looking at one stadium, or this is the stadium we looked at the most and for the longest. So since about 2003, I've been looking at the Maracanã, the World Cup final stadium for you Germans, a place of affective memory, no doubt. The Olympic final, opening, closing ceremonies, etc. And so this stadium was built for the 1950 World Cup, was meant to be the great symbol of Brazil's emergence as the leader of the post-World War II nation. They famously lost to Uruguay in the final, but it was the biggest stadium project since Roman times. 179,000 people in the stadium in a relatively fluid arrangement. So this, remember what I said about the increasing fluidity and decreasing fluidity within the stadiums, this was completely open to the point where the fans would change sides at halftime so they could cheer behind their goal. And this was a completely open space. This lasted for 50 years, biggest stadium in the world. As mega events started moving into Brazil in the 2000s, the stadium underwent a series of deformations. This was the first one that reduced the capacity to 129,000 in 2004. And then in preparation for a decade of mega events, it was closed for 5-6 years, underwent 1.6 billion reais of reforms, 500 million euros. This was a picture taken in 2011, to become this global non-place, this spectacular landscape of consumption with a capacity that was 100,000 less than it was just 14 years before for the consumption of the global spectacle. And now, 6 months after the Olympic Games, it's abandoned. Tragedy. Complete tragedy. Bad, as Trump would say. As I was doing this research in Rio, I was engaged in a lot of civil society groups that were fighting these things. When I first moved to Brazil, back to Brazil in 2009, I helped to found this organization ironically called the ANT, which we would think was actor network theory. Of course, we failed because we only put one ant on there. How can you have an actor network that only has one ant? It doesn't work at all. And so I've written an academic article about the process of forming this group, how it exploded across the Brazilian landscape, and then failed within 2 years, probably because we only had one ant to have a network. Anyway, we can talk about more about this later, but I don't have a lot of time. But these groups were particularly organized around football cultures, around the trying to move against the privatization of the Maracanã. This says for the immediate annihilation of the privatization of the Maracanã. And then this group here, the Comitê Popular, was involved in resisting forced removals and all of the projects associated with the hosting of the World Cup and the Olympics. And I was involved in those groups for the 6 years that I lived in Brazil. And this is the sort of things that we produced, and this is also the kind of thing we produced. So both textual and physical presence on the streets. This is a march that blocked the streets of the neighborhood around the Maracanã, marched to the Maracanã, and had a nice confrontation with the police. This was this is the day of the opening ceremonies of the Olympics. These are my colleagues, all of whom are university professors. And so one of the things that was very common in Brazil, and perhaps a little bit strange in Switzerland and even stranger in the US, is activist scholarship. And so we were very clearly delimiting our position as political actors through our scholarship. And so the research I was doing, which I'll show you in a second, was always feeding into these social movements in order to push against the mega event projects. And we saw no conflict of interest in that whatsoever. And I'm happy to talk about that a bit later. Again, I've written several articles about this. And so in this time, I was at 3 different universities, between a Fulbright and a visiting professorship and the largest ever project looking into sports mega events that covered all 12 cities of the World Cup and the Olympics. And I'm just going to run you through a little bit of what I was doing there in terms of the articles that I've published. So each one of these things that I'm going to show you is an academic article that I've published in the last 6 years. So first of all, there's the current events. And so I moved from this book, Temples of the Earthbound Gods, which is kind of, you could be mistaken for thinking that it's an homage to stadiums, to hunting white elephants, which is obviously pointing out that stadiums are useless infrastructures. And I maintained a blog where I had more than 250 blog posts. I had about five a month for 6 years, or five years, looking at the daily events that were leading into the construction of white elephants that I showed you just a second ago with Maracanã. And then the first article I wrote, really touching on this, was comparing the historical trajectory of mega events over time from throughout the 20th century in Rio. Of course, with mega events come massive security dynamics. There was a 2 billion real budget, 600 million euro security budget, and transportation budget. Massive spending, 20 or 10 billion of the 30 billion spent on the World Cup was for transportation projects. So I looked at it in this context. Here we have the Olympic zones in green, and in the red dots, and this is kind of an older map from 2012, I didn't have time to update it. The red dots are counterinsurgency occupations of favelas, meaning that the military would go in with the shock troops and occupy a favela to take the guns out of drug dealers' hands and insert the presence of the state. And this had a lot of knock-on effects, including gentrification, etc. But these flow, and you can see that they're concentrated in the Olympic zones and along the transportation lines. And so this is a way of both altering and guaranteeing circulations in the city for the event, because these lines are all flowing through the Olympic circles. As a result of this, as a result of the occupation, and a result of the transportation plans, and a result of the Olympic project in general, we had massive gentrifications. And I looked at gentrifications here in these 4 places, comparing them to say there's not just one form of gentrification, but gentrification happens in a lot of different ways in the same city simultaneously. And then these gentrifications were coupled with forced removals of favelas. And so here in green are favelas that were forcibly removed in the period from 2009 to 2014 by the city. They were removed to the far west to government housing. And this is the least developed, poorest, most inaccessible part of the city, which if you saw on the previous map, was not connected with transportation lines to the center. And so the process of hosting these events gentrifies in some areas by forcibly removing, and it also happens in a few other ways that I talk about through development discourses, etc. Of course, when I'm going through all this, I'm still talking about the sports infrastructure, because that's kind of the most symbolic thing that's going on there, and the urban political economy of that. And so who's benefiting from the contracts? Why are these things happening, where they're happening, and how? And one of the most emblematic of these, and this is one of my favorite pictures from that time, was in 2013. This was the Museu do Índio, or the Aldeia Maracanã, which was Brazil's old federal Indian museum, Indian, quote unquote, was next to the Maracanã. And the state said that this museum had to be destroyed so that fans could get to and from the Maracanã more easily. And so it was a problem of circulation. And so this was a place that was occupied by indigenous groups from all over Brazil, who were later expelled by force. And of course, the media is there to make sure that we all know what's going on, although not perhaps able to do much about it. And so this is a cause célèbre among left activists, amongst the literati in Rio, etc. And we were kind of there the whole time documenting how this was happening. And then, of course, the event coalitions and corruption. How does this thing come together both at the local, the national, and the international level? And I'll just explain what's going on here very quickly. Here we have President Lula, former President Lula, the now governor, former vice governor, the former governor of Rio, the former mayor, and Eike Batista, Brazil's formerly most wealthy person. He's in prison, he's in prison, he's under investigation, he's under investigation, he's under investigation, but living in New York City in a self-imposed exile after he finished his term. These guys are all in conversation with Ricardo Teixeira. I don't know if any of you remember him as the vice president of FIFA, but also head of the CBF, the Brazilian Federation, in exile, under investigation. Old Seppi, our friend here, under investigation in disgrace. This guy was the federal sports minister, removed for a corruption investigation. The same guy's in prison. He's also in prison. He was the head of he was also a FIFA vice president. And so these local coalitions merge with national and international coalitions in webs of corruption that have no beginning or end. And so this is something that we can also talk about later, and I'll show you how this works in other contexts. And so with all of these things going, all these moving around the city and finding all these different linkages, I ended up giving a lot of interviews and trying to actively shape the discourse, the media narrative around what was happening in Brazil. And so I became one of the go-to people for foreign journalists and national journalists to talk to about this, and gave more than 350 interviews over the last 6 years, and appeared in a bunch of documentary films. And so at least 25% of my time in some months, or maybe more, around the games themselves, was involved in talking to the media and trying to